we are going to kick things off. We're allowing everyone to come through, so I'm going to get things started. In the interest of time, I appreciate everyone's time in participating in the sessions today. As I mentioned, this is the last of the machine learning and analytics sessions. I'm absolutely delighted to be having the next speaker on board, Mr. Jeff Baker, the CIO advisory lead for NB Business Solutions. Jeff acts as a CIO and a CISO for a large number of organizations right now. And one of his biggest roles that he's been encountering of late has been all around weaponizing data and using that to their advantage. So at this point, I would love to introduce Jeff to you all. Jeff, if you can turn on your video. And there he is. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jeff to introduce himself to you a lot better than I will and to carry on with the presentation. Again, please remember to utilize the Q&A feature here, folks, for all the questions that we will hold at the end. Jeff, over to you.
Very good. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the intro, Jason. So again, my name is Jeff Baker. Let me put this thing going here. There we go. Just so real quickly, for today, we're going to run through, I'll give you a real quick intro to myself and just kind of piggyback on what Jason was just talking about, some of the roles. And then I just want to level set a little bit. So really just at a high level, describe what we're talking about when we're talking about data problems and what those typical responses are. Probably not going to be a whole lot of new material there for most of the folks on the call. But again, I just want to make sure that we're all starting from the same place. And then really what the focus of this conversation is really on that fourth bullet, which is, okay, great. We've got some data problems. We've hopefully figured out some solutions for them. Now what? How do we use that? And it may also add some perspective to that actual solution journey. And then obviously there at the end, if there's any questions or comments or anything like that, would love to go through that with the group. Let me back up real quick. So real quick on the intro. So Jeff Baker, CIO for NB Business Solutions. We're a human capital and IT advisory firm. We've been around for about 5 years. My side obviously is the IT shop. And as Jason mentioned, I'm currently a fractional or interim CIO for roughly 5 companies in the Houston area. And then I provide some advisory guidance to a couple of additional CIOs. As part of that practice, inevitably, we come across infrastructure, data, all types of challenges, security, everything else, everything you could imagine. So a lot of what I've heard through the sessions so far this week have hit home. So I certainly can relate. So that being said, I want to jump in and again, just start to level set and talk about, really what I mean when I'm describing what a data problem is. So it really could root from any number of locations. I think this overarching definition of the inability to deliver the right data, the right time to the right people in a repeatable, predictable, and meaningful format. There's always the competing versions of the truth. What's the system of record? Where is it located? Is it in a file? Is it in a folder? Is it in some application, like I said? Is it in some database table? What are we arguing about? Good tools, bad habits. This actually pops up quite a bit in the mid-market space, and it seems to be tied to, for some reason, the longer these companies have been around, some of these bad habits tend to persist. So what I'm talking about here is this tendency of the heroic effort over leaning on technology and tools. So Bill or Sally has been sitting in between the source of data and the output for 10 years, and that's their job. And we don't want to rattle the tree too much because we might take away some of their job responsibilities. Data hygiene challenges. This is the quality and the governance. So we don't really control what's going into our system. So there really should be no expectation that what's coming out is going to be good at all. Lack of ownership and accountability. Again, I think probably a lot of folks can relate here. Who owns the data? If we're talking about a particular element of data or a table, is this a finance? Is this accounting? Who really drives this? Who owns it? Bad design. This could be the inflexibility of your data models. This could be or dependency on some kind of legacy system. A lot of my clients are oil and gas. Those are notorious for really being clunky, can be hard to get data out of, or certainly data out in a way that's meaningful with current technologies. And then I threw in SharePoint a little bit under the bus, but really it's whatever organizational platform your company is using. So this is that, hey, one-stop shop. We've got SharePoint, that's our platform. We're going to dump everything into it. So that's a handful of potential problem areas. So what are some of the typical approaches to addressing some of that? Really where we've had some pretty good success making some traction is just start somewhere. And that first bullet is we tend to target some type of output or report that is high value, highly visible, high impact. Typically that means it's something financial. So a lot of people care about it, a lot of people see it, and we're going to know pretty quickly if it's right or wrong. So that we take that report and we start working backwards to go isolate where the data constraints or conflicts could be. Garbage in, garbage out. We talked about the quality and governance components. So really controlling what's going into your systems. Again, if it's a zip code, make sure it's numbers and not letters. Pretty simple things. The hub, warehouse, middleware. I believe the RPA conversation earlier today touched on this a little bit. It's that design of the data. Do you have your hub and spoke? Are you putting everything into a lake or a warehouse? Or what's your middle unit where everything is feeding into, so then data can come back out? Obviously, tying to a business objective is always a good approach. You know, I threw in just a couple of examples: reducing costs by X, achieving X percentage of profitability within a BU or across the organization. So again, just some starting places to say, hey, let's start going to solve the data problem as they relate to those problems. So taking all those things into consideration and really starting from the same playing field, what I wanted to do really was talk about taking all this into account. These are pretty typical problems that we walk into. And then how have we solved these? And then now that we're starting to solve these problems, now what? What's really the next step? So that's what I have here, propose a future. And this is where it actually gets pretty interesting, because we start to talk to not only BU leadership, but really leadership in the organization, and start talking about the what if. You know, what's possible? If we could solve these data problems, then what? And what we've kind of defined here is this North Star piece, and I've heard that come up too. And it really is the stretch goal, if you will, for the organization. So just like you would in a review session throughout the year with your merit and everything, really is, if we can solve these data problems today, what's the next thing that we go after? Let's think about the future. So I wanted to pull out a couple of examples and really just, I guess, add some context to what I mean by that. So I want to talk through a project that we did about, it's probably been about 9 years, one that we're currently in, and one that is very early state. And really what draws all these kind of into a similar vein is they all have low margins, as a lot of the mid-markets do. There's a lot of sensitivity into building competitive advantage. Little things matter. So we're really trying to take this data problem that we're starting to solve and think about what can we do in a year or 2 years as we get this under control. So the first thing I want to talk about is an oil and gas company. Again, this was about 8 or 9 years ago. It was an upstream commodity market, you know, the well-defined data sets. So we knew what our costs were. We knew our CapEx and our OpEx. We knew we had good rig data. We had good manpower data, good well data. We knew what it costs to get, you know, 5,000 feet down a hole in the ground in the particular sediment that we were drilling in. You know, those things were well defined. We had all that. What we didn't have was really a handle on how do we then go tie that to some different modeling and forecasting. So this was really about the time when predictive analytics started to gain some traction. But really what we saw was, when you said predictive analytics, really what it meant was part failures. You know, this part's going to fail after so many rotations. And then we would send the crews out to get ahead of that. What we weren't really looking at, though, was based on our known costs, could we then go predict to a certain degree of predictability what our returns on that investment might be based on various factors like commodity pricing, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the other things we jumped into was NPT. So in the oil and gas industry, NPT is non-productive time. So that means part failure, something breaks, we've got to shut down everything, but costs still run. You still got to pay the guys to stand out there. You've still got to rent the equipment. These costs are still generating. It's also lost time in getting it out there for production for sale. So it's lost days in sales. So it was very easy to pull back and say, if the drill bit failed and it took us 3 days to replace it, we had 3 days, we could do those costs, we could see the impact. What we weren't really thinking about though was in the same sediment, with the same equipment, with the same crew, one well might take 30 days to drill. Well, another well in the same area, all the same factors might take 45 days. We never had a part failure, but one took 15 days longer than the other. So was that non-productive time? Not really, certainly not clearly defined the way that a part failure was, but we started to actually look into that and start to study, why these slowdowns were happening, because that did have an economic effect. It did really slow down, our ability to bring product, and then did increase all of the costs that I mentioned before too. So it did make that whole process more expensive. So we started digging into that. More importantly was we went after this well queue, like I talked about a little bit earlier. So if we went to leadership and said, knowing our economics, if we could, factor in these commodity prices that change, certainly several times throughout the day. We know our costs, we know where our crews are. If we could start to line that out, and based on commodity pricing as it was being projected, what would be the next 10 wells to go drill? What would be the most profitable? Would that be something you're interested in? And we got pretty good response. So we started to pursue that, to chase that. So we solved this data problem of, bringing all this data from all of these systems into really a centralized database. And then we started taking it and I guess turning the predictive piece on its head a little bit, because it wasn't just about part failures and some of the more traditional paths that we had heard. It really was taking it now and let's do some cost modeling. Let's really start to understand how it can affect the business, especially in an industry that is driven so much by the commodity price, something out of our control. So 5 cents could really swing what we do operationally speaking. So this is a project that it's been going on for probably about 6 months. We're pretty well into it. We did spend about 2 years getting all of the infrastructure and all of the data positioned correctly on the IT side. So this is for a commercial construction company. Again, margins are extremely low. There's a ton of competition. There's competition for supplies. There's competition for labor. You can very easily price yourself out of a job. If you don't have the parts there on time, if you don't have the people there on time, you might lose the work. So what we were seeing was, again, they were having to pay guys where we may not need a resource for until Thursday, but we were having to bring them out Monday and effectively pay them for the week so we could have them at a future date. So we started looking at, again, we spent so much time getting the IT side of the shop ready. Then we went back to the business and said, okay, now that we have kind of our act together, how can we help you? What if we could do these things for you? What if we could, again, pull all this data together, all of our costs for our jobs, all the costs for our materials, all of our schedules, all of our supers, labor, everything else, and start to look at if we could put the materials and the people on the job at the right time and save some of that cost, would that be valuable to you? And of course, they were very interested. So we started to pursue this. And what we came up with and what we're working through right now is what I put down on that last bullet is really the substitute teacher model. So we know what the skills are that are needed. It may be drywall, it could be acoustics, it could be any number of particular disciplines within the construction industry. We know we need this resource on this day at this time. We know we have these materials on this day at this time. So what we would start to do is, and then we had this known group of of laborers that we had worked with in the past that were already in our system. We knew their rates, we knew everything about them. So we would start to send out these notices, just like a substitute teacher said, hey, we have this job available for this rate, this part of town, for this long. Do you accept it? And we would blast it out to, 50, 100, 200 people. And these folks would actually accept, or that's the project we're working on. They're starting to accept the job, and then they show up. So it's more this real-time delivery. So again, in certain industries, this is nothing new, but for this industry, for construction, this is a little bit of a disruption. If we can time the resources and stay ahead of that, then we become more competitive on our jobs, on our labor, on our costs. We're not paying these guys for long durations just to sit there and chew up all the economics. So this one is very, again, I don't want to quite say cutting edge, it's certainly bleeding edge. And as this develops and starts to roll out, it's getting a lot of traction. There's a lot of excitement around this. And we're really trying to reposition a company that's been around for a long time and better position them in the market. The last one that I want to describe and talk about is, this one's very interesting. This is really a very early stage conversation at this point, almost a think tank, if you will. We really haven't started to solution it. But again, this is another example of kind of setting that stretch goal, looking at what data is available. We're trying to solve the data problem right now of, we have a little bit of data, and this is a livestock company. So we have a little bit of data around how many animals are out there on a particular ranch. And we know how much feedstock they're getting on a daily basis, those kind of things. So there's a little bit of information. What we don't know, though, is as they roam the property, where they're at, how much, are they walking? How are we tracking their location? And there's really no good mechanism right now for that particular industry that says, hey, if X supplier wants, a certain number of animals or poundage of food in 18 months, how can you forecast in that industry? And up to this point, it hasn't really been a problem that's been solved very well. So what we're trying to do right now is pull together the technology side of this of, how do we capture all of this data? So it's tagging the animal in certain ways. It's building the capability for that tagging technology. It's got to be durable. You can't really control weather or climate. You can't really control how the animal behaves or what it may rub up against, or, could it hit a fence post? Could it hit a tree? Could it fall down? Could it knock the tag off or whatever, be destructive? There's obviously constraints around however big the ranch location is, having adequate coverage across that entire facility to make sure that we know where the animals are at all times. There's all of the metrics that go into the nutrition for the animal. Again, that goes into the feed, the quality of the feed, how much they're consuming, how much weight they're gaining. So there's this whole concept of, as they enter the feed location and exit, starting to measure different traits about them. When you think about, I hate to be, insensitive, but there's the harvesting of the animal is the way it's referred to, how much usable product versus how much waste. So again, if you've got to go sell, 1,000 pounds of meat, what does that really translate to in animals that would take to make that? And again, it gets back to this demand component. How could you possibly know how many animals to start with, and then factoring in all those variables to go out and predict, a forecast 18, 24 months out into the future. And really what we're trying to do with this particular organization is they have a real opportunity to capture a significant chunk of market share. They've got a nice deal on the table, so it's certainly a problem we're all trying to solve, and it's a very interesting problem, I think, and certainly has an opportunity to be disruptive. Sorry, Jason was chatting. Let me see here. So I went fast, and I warned Jason that typically I run through these things pretty quickly. But again, what I wanted to do here really was just to, you know, set the stage again for a lot of the problems that we've encountered and potential solutions for them. There certainly is an element of the tactical response and the strategic response, but really it's trying to get the group to think about, you know, while you're solving the current data problem that's on the table, is thinking out into the future, setting that North Star goal, that almost unreachable endpoint, if you will. And the way we position that is, if you know, if you lose your path along the way, you can always stick your head up and find that North Star and get back on track. You know, certainly framing the response in terms of driving the business. You know, hey, if we can, again, going back to the oil and gas concept, if we can deliver with, even if it's 30% accuracy, how much money you'll bring to the table based on commodity pricing of X, that's better than they were doing at the time. They had 0%. For this construction company, if we can trim costs or save money, or put folks in the right spot at the right time, and that makes them more competitive, they can bring their pricing down, or have more margin on the prices that they've got. That's a win for everybody. If we're able to figure out this, the situation with the livestock company, you know, that potentially disrupts an entire market. So it's thinking about not just where do I put my data, or how do I control the quality of my data, or what platform do I stick it in? It's also what's next. You know, once we start to solve those problems, you know, what then does the business really care about? That's the fun stuff. You know, what do we go chase down after that? And that really is that last line is don't just solve the problems of today, but think about, you know, what's further down the road? How do we go after that? And take that back to leadership and talk through that. And hopefully you'll get some buy-in, and you'll get some opportunities like the ones that we've been fortunate enough to be involved in. Because that's really where this stuff gets fun. And Jason, I obviously went short on time, but I don't need to drag it out. If there's any questions or comments or feedback, fire away.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. No, I appreciate it. Nice and short and concise and straight to that point. So obviously, folks, if you've got questions for Jeff right now on this, please do submit them through the Q&A piece. I do have a couple of questions for Jeff. We were just actually running a roundtable discussion on how to perform effective real-time analytics. Okay, so on the topic of kind of like, you know, using your data effectively and essentially weaponizing your data, appreciate you went into it a little bit, but how important is it first and foremost that you get the ground infrastructure in place first and get a nice kind of like a, I suppose, clean database in place, and that it's well managed and well governed in order for you to then utilize it to the best of its ability?
Yeah, I mean, it's paramount. I mean, if you don't have good data, none of the other stuff matters. So, I mean, that's the fundamental blocking and tackling of the effort. You know, and one of the points I was trying to emphasize there too is, but it doesn't mean that while you're solving that, you know, almost a tactical problem there, that you're not thinking further down the road. You know, once we solve this, what can we do with it next? Because, you know, the sexy part is the what do we do next. The essential part is, you know, if we can't report our financials or have confidence in the data that we're reporting, then there's really no point. But that being said, once we solve that problem, where we start to make some traction and get going on that road, what's the next set of problems we get to go solve? What's really the juicy stuff that we can get into?
Okay. Obviously, given the fact that mid-market organizations have considerably less budgets than our large enterprise friends, is there even more emphasis on being able to utilize the data at your disposal to kind of, you know, reduce overheads, to increase market awareness, to introduce new products, et cetera, et cetera? Like, is there a greater emphasis on mid-market to get a grip of this because of the benefits?
I think so. You know, I think because, you know, there typically aren't the even if the budget's there, they may not be ready for some of these technologies. I've had an interesting time having conversations at the executive level, things like machine learning, and you know, in a smaller, mid-sized company, you know, and these could be, you know, a couple of $1 billion in revenue. So they're not necessarily, you know, mom and pop shops, but to them, machine learning is is so far out, especially if it's a short-term goal of flipping the business and selling to a larger entity. They're not wanting to increase costs unless, again, there's a compelling story for that. But what we've certainly the middleware conversation, there's typically been some interest in the spin there, because that does become your hub for data. But yeah, there's certainly a reluctance to go out and spend a bunch of money. So we've solved a lot of problems with tools on hand. We don't sell tools. So if you've got Microsoft, if you've got SQL, if you've got Oracle, whatever you may have, solve it with what's there first, and really focus on the quality and the governance of the data. And then that opens you up to the tool set. I think in the one of the presentations I've heard, and it may have been yesterday's keynote with Kit, don't let the tool drive the business. So if you position your data the right way, you effectively become tool agnostic, and you're not dependent. The tool doesn't tell you how your business should run. You can actually open that up and go solve the problems the way you need to, and find the tool that best fits you.
So again, just going back to this conversation around the roundtable we just ran around real-time analytics, etc. So from a CIO's perspective, can I ask, what should our fellow CIOs be demanding of the data leaders within the organization? If we have the luxury of having, for example, a head of data, whether that be data governance, data management, data analytics, what we should be demanding from them in order for you to be able to effectively align the IT strategy with that of the business?
The accountability piece, and if you have that role, certainly you're on that path, but there's an ownership component that a lot of times is lacking, or there's the competing versions of the truth. Someone ultimately has to be the decision maker that says that's where we're going to pull from, and we're all going to at least have the same conversation from the same set of data. I think the other piece is understanding your business process. Hopefully if you're small doesn't necessarily mean you're not complex, but you certainly have a better shot if your application suite is smaller than some of these organizations with hundreds of applications. But figuring out how data flows within an application across potentially multiple applications, those kind of things are certainly things that you should address. I have seen probably the most extreme case of the quality conversation was one company we worked with actually tied part of the performance goals to the data quality within those business units. So the finance department, and they set up various metrics that kind of prove this out, had to have a certain level of data quality or it affected bonus. So obviously the quickest way to generate the results you wanted, you affect pay. That's happened once out of the probably 100 or so clients we've worked with, but so it's certainly not common, but I've seen that happen too. But the quality, the accountability, and really agreeing on the source of the truth are probably the key things you got to start with.
Okay, a couple of questions coming in from the audience now as well. Mario asked, do you see companies having the right personnel for weaponizing data? This kind of goes to that, he says he's noticed most places already have a good amount of collection, but no one really to analyze or use it. So how do you justify those new employees on the front end?
Well, and we haven't justified new employees. That's the role that I'm kind of encouraging the CIOs to potentially take on. Or if you've got a deputy on your team that might be able to handle that. If you've got an application leader, that might be the right person. But really myself, when I've been positioned as the CIO, those are the conversations that I've had with the business leaders, or the executive team. And a lot of times those conversations have started as simply as, hey, if we had an opportunity, let's pick on the construction company. If we had the opportunity to, put people in the right place at the right time, just for the day or for 4 hours, and really save some costs, is that something that's interesting to you? And, typically the response is yes. And it's like, okay, well, that opens the conversation, and then you can start to address it and say, well, if we do X, Y, and Z, then potentially we can go solve that problem. But it's almost planting the seed, engaging the interest. Certainly if there's no interest or support, it's not going to happen. So you've got to get a little bit of that buy-in. But again, creating that stretch goal, creating that buzz, creating that excitement, you got to do it, but you've still got to build out the right starting blocks. You've got to put in the data quality, the governance, all the things we've talked about. That's got to be in place before you can go get and have the fun stuff happen.
Mm.
But I've actually taken on that role in my seat because I've got the right audience at that point. I can have those conversations, and really, it's if you position it as a business problem that IT is helping to solve. That's the other element of this is not IT's project. We might be managing it, or we might be supplying a resource or some thought leadership to it, but it really needs to be a business project that IT is supporting.
Got you. Okay. Rick Wagner asks, or states and then asks, so he says, I know the end game or the North Star goal, but need to stage the infrastructure we build on incrementally so as to not break the bank on the way to that goal. So any advice on how to manage this process as we grow? It seems regrettably unavoidable that we will need to change tool sets over time, but how far can we go with Microsoft as our platform, Dynamics CRM, Azure, SQL, Power BI, etc.?
So the question was obviously prioritizing the spend. How far can the current tool set potentially stretch? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, no, is, how do we start going on that journey and getting towards the end goal without breaking the bank, essentially?
Yeah, so it's a prioritization exercise. I mean, I think first you start with the tools, and you've acknowledged that. You almost exhaust the capabilities. That's why I threw SharePoint out there. That's a very common response. The executives love the fact that, hey, we've paid for it, we're licensed for it, let's use it. And then you get down that road, and it, typically, I don't want to say always, but it typically doesn't turn out to be the solution that maybe everyone thought it was going to be. So some of this, you almost need you kind of plant the seed a little bit and get folks talking. I've had plenty of opportunities, and I'll pick on these construction guys again. I did an assessment 18 months ago and identified some areas that I thought were going to be problematic in the data space. And the first reaction was, I don't even understand what any of this means. And then 6 months later, we revisited, and it was, hey, this sounds kind of familiar. And 18 months later, we're doing this project that I'm talking about. So sometimes it's that, just like with a kid, there's a little bit of that parenting that happens. You kind of plant the seed and you go away, and eventually it becomes their idea. So you can work it that way. But certainly I would exhaust the technology. I'm sensitive to that, which is why we don't sell anything tool-wise again. It's let's see what you have first. Let's certainly explore every opportunity to exploit that to its limits. But once we reach the limits, if you're able to position it again, if we can do X and the company can benefit in this way, is this meaningful? Is this important? And then it's a matter of prioritizing spend. It's not easy.
Oh, no, no, it's not. So final question I have for you is more to do with, obviously, the ability to analyze these data sets, or the ability to initially store the data sets and then analyze, very much falls down to the tools that you're able to purchase, right? The vendor community, those software providers. How, or what advice can you give to CIOs to create better relationships with the vendors, so the vendors take a bit more of a consultative role when it comes to understanding the true needs of you and your organization, versus just trying to sell you the latest shiny software they have?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a good answer, because I fight that a lot as well. We've actually shifted more to, trying to, putting a little bit of that onus on our team as well, so they can help push back to these vendors. Because, yeah, like you said, the vendors are going to come in and sell the next shiny penny and tell you how it's going to save your life and save the world. And sometimes it does, but most of the times it falls short. We've tried to solve, again, I'll go back, if we can solve it with SQL and Excel, at least as a first cut or a proof of concept, then we'll do that. If we're heavily invested in a tool, that may be a little bit different play. I know a couple of groups I work with are for whatever reason, are in love with JD Edwards. And that's a very challenging system to work with, and it's not cheap. And they keep coming out and saying we can do more and more and more, and we've yet to see any of it. So we fight that continuously. I think you probably have to push back on the sales guy and get more to what I'm going to call the smarter guys, not just the ones selling it, but the ones who do it, and really sit down and maybe understand your agreement with that vendor. And are there consultative hours built into it? Can you negotiate some of that up front? But have them sit down at the table and say, look, we're trying to do these types of things, and we're not able to either we need to get smarter, you need to help us get smarter about it, or you need to help provide some consultative services to this. Hopefully mid-market's tougher because you may not be their biggest client. You may not have as much leverage, but if you're able to squeeze some time out of them, it's certainly worth a shot. But we've done that ourselves. We've put a little bit of that onus on our team. We've worked a little bit more closely with the business to understand what the data means and what we should be expecting. But when it comes, the vendor's a tricky one. And it's hard, I think, being mid-market because, like I said, you're not Exxon. You're not driving the ship all the time. So that's a tough one. I don't know that I have a good answer off the top of my head for that. That's a tough one.
No worries. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Greatly appreciated. Fantastic insight there, and amazing, as I said, just to hear the perspective of various different case studies and organizations and industries and how they're doing this kind of stuff. It's an ongoing challenge for everyone. There's no denying that everyone sees the value, obviously data being the new gold, and everyone sees that, but trying to get to grips with it all and then use it effectively continues to be a challenge for a lot of folks, especially in this mid-market space. So thank you very much for your time. That's it for today's session, and that is it for day 2 of the Mid-Market IT and Security Leaders Virtual Forum. So thank you all again for your participation today and for sticking around with us.